This Golden Age pulp hero is Captain Future, and he was created by two Buck Rogers fans at the very first North American science fiction convention. Mystery, adventure, romance. During the golden age of pulp magazines, these were all very popular genres, but the fans of these genres were nowhere near as passionate as the fans of science fiction. There's a mystique with science fiction that brings out the passion in fans and the need to seek each other out. Sci-fi fans formed fan clubs, held gatherings, and printed fanzines as far back as the 1890s. One of the earliest sci-fi pop culture sensations was the novel The Coming Race by Edward Bulwer Lytton. The book was published in 1871, and it sold extremely well. The author, Edward Bulwer Lytton, was the second best-selling author of the 19th century, only surpassed by his friend, Charles Dickens. The Coming Race is a story about a man who discovers an advanced underground civilization. The underground people are called the Vril-Ya. They have reddish skin, and their culture mimics ancient Egypt. Their power source is a liquid that some people have the ability to mentally control. This liquid power source is called the Vril. The Vril-Ya Bazaar took place in London at the Royal Albert Hall in 1891. It was the first English sci-fi convention. It was a week-long event, and it began with a grand opening ceremony with members of the British royal family. There were vendors, lectures, and fans walked around in costume. If a modern fan could attend, they probably would feel right at home there. From what I've read, the Vril-Ya Bazaar had what us modern fans would call a steampunk, ancient Egypt vibe going on. It would take some time before sci-fi conventions would make it to America, almost 50 years in fact. This build-up began with a few very small fan club gatherings in the late 1930s, and it would continue to grow from there. And this would lead to what is considered the first modern sci-fi convention. The first World Science Fiction Convention took place in New York City at Caravan Hall in 1939. Like their British cousins, the American sci-fi fans showed their love for the genre. One of these costume-clad fans was none other than famous future Monsters of Filmland publisher Forrest J. Ackerman. He was a teenager at the time. Ackerman and his girlfriend got a number of their friends to dress up in costume and parade around the hall. Many historians point to this moment as the start of modern cosplay. Worldcon 1 was the first US science fiction convention that was open to the public. However, only a few hundred people attended. This con was actually more aimed at people working in the publishing industry. Science fiction pulp magazines were a big part of the publishing market at this time. The majority of attendees were writers, illustrators, editors. They were people working in the publishing world or trying to break in. The type of passion that created this convention can also be divisive. In New York City at this time, there were a number of science fiction clubs, and these clubs were very territorial and cliquish. Some of the cliques were based on locations such as Queens versus Brooklyn. Other cliques formed around philosophical beliefs. One group, calling themselves the Futurians, protested Worldcon 1 and attempted to start up a rival convention at another location. The Futurians were a group of writers who pushed Marxism in their narratives, and they encouraged other sci-fi writers to do the same. They turned their back on mainstream sci-fi publishers. And at this time, the mainstream publishers treated science fiction stories as space westerns or space operas. Futurian stories are usually set in futuristic socialist societies, but often, instead of promoting socialism or communism, many of their stories accidentally become critiques of it. Worldcon 1, with all this drama, was the backdrop where Captain Future was created. Two of the attendees, like most of the people who were there, had ties to the publishing world. Leo Margulies was an editor for Ned Pines. Pines, you might remember from some of my other videos, owned and operated a number of different pulp and comic book lines under different names. Margulies was a veteran magazine editor. Prior to the convention, he had worked for a number of publishers, and he'd also spent 5 years working for the Fox Film Studios in their research department, acquiring stories that could be adapted to film. Another attendee was Mort Weisinger. Before becoming an editor at DC Comics, Weisinger had written, edited, and published science fiction fanzines. And a few years before Worldcon, he had started the Solar Sales Service, which was the first literary agency dedicated to science fiction writers and illustrators. Margulies and Weisinger were both firmly in the mainstream science fiction camp. They were both huge fans of Buck Rogers. In fact, Weisinger's love of Buck Rogers is what got him started printing fanzines in the early 1930s. They both loved the space opera, space western stories that the Futurians despised. The two men had crossed paths numerous times, and on the floor of Worldcon, they bumped into each other. And at first they began talking shop, and then they began talking about Buck Rogers, and then they came up with an idea. They would create a new sci-fi hero in the vein of Buck Rogers. Margulies would publish it, and Weisinger would represent the writer and get a commission. There on the convention floor, they came up with the name Captain Future. And before they parted, they agreed that writer Ed Hamilton should write the series. Hamilton was a celebrated science fiction writer whose style reflected their taste for space westerns. Hamilton was born in Youngstown, Ohio, and at an early age he was declared a child prodigy. He started college at age 14, but the pressure was too much for him and he dropped out before getting his degree. Hamilton took up fantasy and science fiction writing. Very shortly, he was published in Weird Tales. In 1932, his story, The Island of Unreason, won the Jules Verne Award for Best Science Fiction Short Story. At the time of Worldcon 1, Hamilton was at the top of his writing game. His stories jumped from genre to genre. He did mysteries, westerns, science fiction, romance, and sci-fi. You name it, he wrote it. For these stories, he used several pen names. Sometimes he would find a magazine publishing 2 or even 3 of his stories in the same issue, all under different names he used. On Captain Future, Hamilton delivered everything that science fiction readers wanted: action, adventure, and romance, all set on a galactic frontier. Captain Future is Curtis Newton. Before he was born, his parents Roger and Elaine were scientists. Along with their elderly colleague Simon, they fled the Earth to escape an evil oligarch named Victor Corvo. They find haven in an isolated laboratory on the moon, and it was there where Curtis was born. For some time, they lived in peace. In addition to building a family, they built a robot named Greg and a shape-shifting android named Otho. They also continued working on their experiments. The Newtons' goal is to transfer a human brain into a new body. When old Simon was about to die, the Newtons transferred his brain into an electric box. Simon's brain lives on and has the ability to communicate. Their tormentor, Victor Corvo, finds out about their success. He is in a similar situation as Simon. He is an elderly man trapped in a withering shell of a body, and he wants the Newtons to keep him alive. After finding out where the Newtons are hiding, Corvo and a small group of mercenaries go to the moon. The Newtons refuse to help, and in a burst of anger, Corvo kills them. Greg and Otho jump into action to protect baby Curtis, and they kill Corvo and his hired mercs. In the end, the only survivors of the Moon Laboratory massacre are baby Curtis, Greg, Otho, and Simon. The trio raise Curtis into adulthood. They teach him science and math. They train him to be a skilled athlete and familiar with the philosophies of the universe. They raise him to be the perfect model of body and mind. The murder of his parents has given him an unbendable sense of right and wrong. With the goal to help people across the galaxy, Curtis Newton becomes Captain Future, the wizard of science, the man of tomorrow. Captain Future's adventures have him going across the solar system, helping people and fighting evil wherever it appears. And he doesn't do it alone. He has a group of friends that join him on his adventures. In addition to Greg, Otho, and Simon, there's Joan Randall, an agent of the Planetary Patrol. She becomes his love interest. Oddly enough, she was raised in a similar isolated situation as Curtis, and the two struggle to communicate with each other, which leads to them suppressing their human romantic desires. Another ongoing character is Space Marshal Ezra Gurney. He's a wise old sage who often comes to Captain Future for help. Together, the group often finds themselves facing off against Ulkorn, the magician from Mars. Ulquorn is the son of Victor Corvo, and twice as evil. Shortly after the first stories were published, the teenage sidekick wave hit comics. Attempting to cash in on this trend, Captain Future is joined by space orphan Johnny Kirk. As pulp heroes go, Captain Future had a pretty good run. He starred in his own magazine from 1940 to 1944, and with the cancellation of his magazine, Captain Future moved on to Startling Stories. There, his adventures would continue on an irregular basis until 1951. One aspect of Captain Future that helped attract readers was the classic sci-fi covers done by Earl Berge. Berge was a highly in-demand freelance illustrator during the pulp age. He worked on hundreds, if not thousands, of magazine covers. He illustrated magazines as prestigious as the Saturday Evening Post and found steady work in risque magazines like Snappy. When the pulp age came to an end, Berge easily moved on to doing covers for paperback novels. His work covered all genres, and he's highly regarded for his good girl art. Publisher Ned Pines owned a number of comic book lines. Better Comics, Standard, and Nidor were all owned by him. But for some unknown reason, the pulp version of Captain Future did not cross over to the comics. The name Captain Future did, but the character was completely redesigned. In the comics, Captain Future is a contemporary superhero who fights Nazis and mad scientists. In this Captain Future storyline, his alter ego is Andrew Bryant. He's a scientist who has bathed himself in gamma and infrared rays. He has super strength and is assisted by his detective girlfriend Grace Adams. Captain Future, the pulp hero, came to an end in 1951, and writer Ed Hamilton's career began to wane. The Futurian movement had splintered, and members had turned on each other, but many of these members had gone on to become editors and publishers. By 1950, half of the science fiction magazines being produced were controlled by former Futurians. They looked at Hamilton's writing as archaic, a product from a different time period. And even though he had built up a fan base with Captain Future, they weren't interested in publishing him. Hamilton found work in comic books, mystery magazines, and cheap paperbacks. But as time moved on, he was no longer a celebrated name. As the years clicked by, he found less and less opportunities to be published. Then, in the late 1960s, his early stories began appearing in anthology collections, and new readers began to take notice. Genres come and go, and space operas began to find new audiences. However, Hamilton passed away in 1977, just 2 months before the greatest sci-fi opera of them all hit the movie theaters. After the release of Star Wars, publishers took interest in his stories again. Star Wars mania created a wave of science fiction that washed over every form of entertainment. In 1978, Captain Future appeared in Japan as an anime series. This series was syndicated around the world and became a huge hit in France and Italy. This anime series used Ed Hamilton's stories and remained faithful to his character concepts. Altogether, 53 episodes were produced. Since then, the Captain Future franchise has been relatively silent, drifting off into deep space, forgotten, a lost hero. Hi everyone, FizzFop here. Thank you for watching. Please hit the like button. It helps me with the YouTube gods, and I really appreciate your help. This video was another one of these videos. I started this, believe it or not, like 2 years ago, and I just kept chipping away at it until it was done. And I went down a lot of rabbit holes along the way, and that's one of those things that slows me down because I start looking for stories and ideas, and I start getting interested in stuff that I'm discovering about. I'm discovering stuff as I go down these rabbit holes. I went down the science fiction convention rabbit hole and found out about groups like the Futurians, and that was a group I never heard of before. And it turns out the Futurians had some pretty big names in science fiction among them. Isaac Asimov, for example, was a name that constantly got dropped. And from what I've been reading and stuff, the Futurians sort of basically just all turned on each other. And What ended up happening was they splintered off into various groups and various cliques. And what happened then was a lot of them went on to become editors and publishers. This led to them taking over a huge chunk of the publishing industry in the world of science fiction, and their impact lasted 20, 30 years beyond the time period I talked about, well into the 1970s and 80s. Another rabbit hole I went down was I found a couple of websites that have scans of pulp magazines. Here's 3 of them up on the screen right now that I'm sharing with you. The reading is free. Check them out. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of pulp magazines that have been scanned, and they have some great stories in there. Check them out. And yet another rabbit hole I went down was the Edward Bulwer Lytton rabbit hole, and he's an example of how fragile fame is. This guy would be considered a major influencer in the second half of the 19th century. Everybody would have known his name. They would have known his quotes. They would have known who he was. He was a member of British Parliament. He was the Secretary of State of the Colonies for the British Empire, which was not a minor cabinet position at all. It was like one of the major heavy hitters of the day. One aspect of Edward Bulwer Lytton I found was sort of funny was that he once started a novel with the line, "It was a dark and stormy night." A lot of people consider this to be the worst novel ever written. And what happened was a university out in California, it starts with an S, I'm drawing a blank on it. It might be San Jose State or Santa Barbara, the University of Santa Barbara, or possibly San Diego State. It's a California university. It starts with an S. I'm drawing a blank at the moment. But what they did was they started a contest where people could, contestants, write their imaginary opening line to the worst novel ever written. And the first year they did it, they got 3 entries. And then, like last year, they had over 10,000 entries. So I spent some time like reading over some of the winners and stuff, and some of them were pretty funny. Edward Bulwer Lytton is sort of a forgotten person today. Except for his name pops up in Nazi conspiracy stories. And that was another rabbit hole I went down. And the story turns out is total bullshit. There was a Berlin Vril Society in the 1920s and 30s, and it was basically a science fiction fan club, and it existed like other coming race fan clubs did across Europe. But there's no real information about what was going on. We know that it exists because there's advertisements or announcements for it in newspapers that they're having meetings and stuff like that, but there's no records of who was in the membership or what they did during their meetings. And it wasn't until the late 1960s before anyone tried to tie the Berlin Vril Society to the Nazis. And it was done by writers who specialized in conspiracy theories. And it was easy for them to tie a book called The Coming Race to the Nazis because of their preoccupation with race. And there's no hard evidence saying that this science fiction club had anything to do with high-ranking Nazis. And again, this was the Star Wars of its day, and everybody would have been exposed to it. And one of the things that The Coming Race had a huge impact on was slang terms at the time. So the word vril, turns out, became like a universal slang term for power or energy. And Germans of the 1920s and 30s would have used that term to describe energy. And I think that that's another reason why they've tried to connect and tie Nazism to The Coming Race and Edward Bulwer Lytton and the Vril Society. But like I said, there's no documented proof of anything. And finally, another rabbit hole I went down was the whole Buck Rogers, is he in public domain situation. And it turned out that the publisher's family and the author's family had been in courts fighting each other for a number of years over ownership of Buck Rogers. But they sort of worked out a sort of a soft agreement where they both have the ownership of it. And both of them are in development deals for television series. And altogether, I found out there was 3 television series in development for Buck Rogers right now. 3 different entities are doing TV shows, which I think is awesome. But the character is going to go into public domain full on in 2025. And one of these TV shows has none other than George Clooney involved with it. So I'm looking forward to all of them. The original story, Armageddon 2419 AD, is in public domain, and it's considered to be the first appearance of Buck Rogers, but he used the name Anthony Rogers, not Buck Rogers. The name Buck Rogers would turn out like a year later in the comic strip, and that was when he was Buck Rogers in the 25th century. And all of that goes, the Buck Rogers in the 25th century is what goes in public domain in 2025, which is just around the corner. I expect to see a lot of Buck Rogers product coming out. You know how for some of the pulp characters like Domino Lady, there's mugs, there's t-shirts, there's new versions, new stories and all that kind of stuff. You're going to see that with Buck Rogers in a big way. If I was a smart person, I would hold off on doing a Buck Rogers video until he goes into public domain, and then I would also use it to start up my Kickstarter or Indiegogo for a Buck Rogers graphic novel. If I was smart, and I'd have like a whole year to get it done and have it ready for you. Don't know if it's going to happen. Probably not. Too lazy. Anyway, this is a good jumping off spot, I think. My throat's starting to go. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please hit the like button. I'd like to take a moment and thank everyone who posts my videos on their social media or put them in the various Facebook groups or help spread the word about my channel. I really want to thank you. I just suck at it, so I don't have to do it, and I really appreciate it. Appreciate it when you guys do that. As for that, thank you again for watching, and I guess I'm out of here. So until next time, stay super. Bye.